Thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant. If you threw a party and invited everyone you knew, you would see the biggest gift would be from me, and the card attached would say, thank you for being a friend.
Good morning, everybody. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Greg Garrett. Greg is the Carole and McDaniel Hanks Chair of Literature and Culture at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. His new book with Orbis Books is titled The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. Greg holds degrees from the University of Central Oklahoma, Oklahoma State University, and the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest. Currently, he also serves as the Canon Theologian at the American Cathedral in Paris. I loved my conversation with Greg. I found it incredibly compelling. He's a great person, a great friend, and I hope you will check out his new book that is out today. Thank you so much, and let's listen in. Greg Garrett, thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
Rob, it's my pleasure to be here and talk with you today.
You know, when we inhabit these spaces that you and I inhabit, it's very easy, in a sense, to get lost in a vocabulary and a lexicon and an encyclopedia of who people are and what people mean and what their place is in the world. One of the questions that came to mind when I was forming my questions for this interview is, who is James Baldwin?
Well, the simple answer is that James Baldwin is one of the great artists and writers in American literature. And I have started to lean into my baseball-loving heritage when I think about Baldwin, because there is literally no one like him in the field of American literature. And so, like, when you talk about in baseball, it's like, throws, hits, hits for average, hits for power, runs, there are so few people who did and excelled in all the spheres that he excelled. And I have long ago given up talking about Baldwin as a great Black artist or a Black gay artist. He is a great American writer in the same way that Spike Lee is a great American director. And so what he did was he was someone who wrote great novels, great essays, great literary criticism, and he was also a powerful advocate and activist for civil rights during the 50s, 60s, 70s. And he's also a sort of transformational figure. As a teacher, a professor at Baylor University, I have taught James Baldwin to multiple classes who don't necessarily share his identity, as I don't share his identity. But like every great writer, he reminds us of what it means to be human. He reminds us of what our great destiny is together if we can achieve it. And he reminds us about how great art can transform us. And so what I would say to our listeners today is that James Baldwin is one of the most important American writers ever. And what I've been saying of late is also this. We are right now in the 60th anniversary of The Fire Next Time. And at this time, 60 years ago, this was the #1 nonfiction book in America. It was on the bestseller list for 41 weeks. And the first 7 pages of this book, I will hold up against any 7 pages of prose by any American writer ever. That's how important I think he is.
So you've said the who. I'm curious why. Why does Greg Garrett write a book on James Baldwin?
That is fair. One of the tiniest pieces of pushback I've gotten lately is that I wrote a book about James Baldwin as a person looking like you and me. And this is also pushback we get in the spheres where we work. where we say, white people need to talk about racism as well. And so what I wanted to do with this book really was to say, James Baldwin has these pieces of identity that define who he is. Because when I write a novel, for example, there's a whole bunch of Greg Garrett in this novel. And honestly, there's a whole bunch of Greg Garrett in this book, The Gospel According to James Baldwin. But what Mr. Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize speech, which I quote early on in the book, is that every great artist operates out of their postage stamp of land. So that, their sort of defined identity. I am this, and this. And as I mentioned early on in the book, if you start comparing yourself to James Baldwin, create a Venn diagram, there are a whole lot of us who don't match up well with him in terms of identity. But what I find over and over again as I read Baldwin and as I teach Baldwin, and sometimes as Baldwin sneaks into my sermons, as he did this past Sunday in Little Rock, Arkansas, is that Baldwin, because he's a great artist, blows up all of our notions of how we are confined by identity. And he reminds us of our shared humanity. And even when he's talking about racism in America, which is one of his central subjects, he's saying, at the end of the day, we are all constrained by our history. Black people have to live with this daily set of injustices, but white people are also in chains because of this. And our shared destiny, our shared future, our shared freedom is in this movement forward together. And so that is the thing that I love about him. And the reason I spent 6 years working on this book, and Rob, you know this about your own writing projects, you have to love a topic so much that you can't not write about it. So Baldwin has been in my backpack every day for 10 years. And wherever I go on this planet, there's going to be a James Baldwin book in my backpack. And short of the Bible, there is nothing in this life that tells me more about how to live my life than the work of James Baldwin.
The book you've written is called The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. It's out by Orbis Books this weekend. I'm curious, James Baldwin, though, when I think of when I think of James Baldwin, when I'm sitting on my little perch and looking at him, he would have hardly been considered a saint in his day by the rising tide of anti-Blackness, of phobias and misunderstandings around who he was and what he espoused. Yet at the end of your book, which is one of the most compelling chapters for me, you talk of Baldwin as a saint. You write, saints are not saints because they're picture perfect. They're saints because they show up and put their hands in the real and get them dirty. And they're saints because they inspire us. I don't think I like my saints picture perfect, and it seems like you're in the same boat. Right? Like this is James Baldwin. He, if he were put up for a church council, I don't know at the time of his death, they would have said, he stamp of approval, sainthood, and yet his life and witness speaks in such a way that it might be worthy of that title.
Oh, Rob, there's so much to open up there. So let me start with this. Last fall, I was asked to preach at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, one of the great progressive Baptist churches in America, on All Saints Sunday. And I preached about Dr. King and Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. And if we imagine that what the saints do is to teach us what it means to live and to love and to reach for the divine and to pursue justice. Those are three of my most powerful influences. If what we value in the saints is to say, you have done this work and I can emulate it, then Baldwin is absolutely in this place. So one of the things that I had to wrestle with, of course, is that, Baldwin was a really proficient, powerful teenage preacher in the Black church in Harlem. And he left the church for theological reasons. And he, in a sense, turned his back on organized religion. But you and I both know that there are people who turn their backs on organized religion who do not turn their backs on God. And throughout his life, Baldwin continued to work in the metaphors and tropes and images of the Bible and of the Christian faith. In the correspondence that I examined for the book, over and over again, not only do we find Baldwin doing that in his letters, but asking people to pray for him. And in an open letter to Desmond Tutu toward the end of his life, he said, I am not a person of faith. And then he stopped and collected himself. And we know that this is a conscious decision. He's an artist. He is revising himself. And instead of saying, I'm not a person of faith, he said, I'm not a churchgoer. And then at the end of that letter, he closed it by saying, in the faith. And what he said to Desmond Tutu is, people tell me that I never stopped being a preacher, and I suspect that they are right. So I am one of those, and there are plenty of people. Dante Stewart is another, who suggests that while Baldwin left the church, he continued to be inspired by the King James Bible, by the stories of the faith. And what I talk about in the book are two particular things. He talks a lot about the New Jerusalem, that idea of the world that is to come, in which, hatred will be extinguished, our identities will not matter. And throughout his life, he talked about the welcome table. And Rob, you probably know, there's a great Black spiritual. I'm going to sit at the welcome table one of these days. It was one of the spirituals that he loved. He was a huge fan of the spirituals. In fact, at his memorial service in New York City, they played Baldwin singing a spiritual. And at the end of his life, he was working on a play called The Welcome Table, which I have read at the Schomburg Research Center in Harlem, read various drafts of it. It was not finished, but it very clearly was playing into his desire for us to find some place where we're all loved and welcomed and seen and known. And there is no judgment, only love. And love is the primary teaching of Baldwin. And so when I think about what do we want from the saints, I don't like these warlike saints, I don't need somebody who goes into battle and chops off people's heads for God, because my daily struggle is I'm not going to go and chop people's heads off for God. I've got to try and love people all day, because particularly in the culture where we are in right now, it is so hard to love each other. And Baldwin offers me that witness day by day that I really desperately need.
My wife, Stephanie, when we first met in college, she's the one who dreamed up this podcast, by the way. She introduced me to the love of the City of Lights. When she studied abroad in Paris for a summer, and that was one of the longest summers of my life to be away from her. Especially being young and in love, she took a flat cutout of me in an alb. I was associate pastor at a church at the time, and so she did like a flat Stanley, flat Rob kind of thing, and took pictures with me of all the different Parisian artifacts and landmarks. You yourself are the Canon Theologian of the American Cathedral in Paris, an Episcopal Cathedral, part of the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe. Right. I've had the privilege of standing in that pulpit. It's a phenomenal church, phenomenal people. And when I was in Paris, I felt like it was haunted by Baldwin. It was almost like you would walk around a corner and you would see him there at a cafe. And knowing good and well, I'm a bleeding heart liberal mainline Protestant who doesn't always know what he thinks about those things. What is it about Paris and Baldwin that both inspires writers and thinkers, but also beckons us to where you're going back soon. I would love to go back soon. You know, we all want to get to Paris. What is it about Paris and that appeal there?
You know, I think there's a couple of things there. And you know, stepping back from Baldwin, even just a tiny bit to go a little bit more global, like 30,000 feet, Paris has always been a place where American writers and artists have gone to seek some freedom that they didn't find in the States. And, you know, whether we're talking about Gertrude Stein or Ernest Hemingway, Richard Wright, there's this long history, Josephine Baker, oh, God bless her. This long history of people going to this place where they could be their most authentic selves. And honestly, a place where their desire to create beautiful things was honored in a way that it is not always honored in this sort of puritanical, pragmatic society that has mostly been in place in America over 200 some years. So for Baldwin, it was this place where he thought, I can be myself. I can be myself in terms of my sexuality. I can be myself in terms of race. And, you know, I've spent enough time in Paris over the last 10 years to recognize that although France believes itself to be post-racist, it is absolutely not post-racist. And one of the things that Baldwin writes early on in his career, like he was in France early, and he realized that, you know, what makes me different here is not the color of my skin, how people think and react to the color of my skin, but the color of my passport. And so that's a whole other kettle of worms. You know, what racism and xenophobia looks like in France. But what Richard Wright had told Baldwin was that I'm treated with honor here. And Baldwin, once he got over this sort of early poverty-stricken phase of his experience in Paris, found that in Paris and in the south of France where he lived, you know, until the end of his life. And so I think that following Baldwin around in Paris, you know, and seeing him on every corner, as you were talking about, is just a reflection of the idea that in Paris there's so much honor given to people who try and pursue their art to tell the truth. And the race thing aside, if you can ever put it aside, what Richard Wright said is, you know, I am treated just like a human being here. And for much of his life, Baldwin had that same experience. There's an early phase in his life when he was put in a French prison. And I write about that, I think, in the Justice chapter of this book. And it's funny and it's horrifying. It's like Kafka-esque in its, you know, kind of difficulties. One of Baldwin's friends had stolen a sheet from the hotel where he was staying, and Baldwin had put it on his bed. And so he and this friend were both taken up by the police, and they were put in prison. And Baldwin just said, you know, I think I might still be in prison if I hadn't been able to reach out to a white lawyer that I'd done some like contract work for as a clerk who could vouch for me. So I don't want to over romanticize Paris, although I love Paris dearly and have done amazing work there. And a huge part of this book was written in Paris, at the American Cathedral and at the American Library in Paris. But I think Baldwin, with his long-standing desire to tell the truth and the whole truth, is like, yes, Paris was great for me, France was great for me, but it's not perfect. And I recognized a lot of the inequities there. And because I held an American passport, for the most part, I was able to not be affected by them the same way that if I had been Algerian, say, I was. So I come to this as somebody who loves Paris, but is not romantically, you know, blinded by it.
Well, you did just
And
write a novel about it, though, too. I mean, you're writing books like crazy. But so Bastille Day, by the way, for those who might be interested. So,
oh, thank you, Rob.
yeah.
And one of the things about that novel is, like, people come to Paris to fall in love. That's Emily in Paris, God help us, is one of the things that people are watching right now. But Paris is more than just this romantic stereotype. It's a real life city. It is full of immigrants. It is full of tensions, and I love it. But I don't have any more romanticism about it than I do about New York City or about Washington, D.C. It's a great city, and there are lots of opportunities, and it's a place where artists can do their work. But there's also a ton of injustice that needs to be seen and addressed.
So Baldwin, I have friends who I think of in my own life. Rua is one of them. Rua is a state representative in the Georgia state legislature. She's an amazing woman I've known for over a decade. She is one of those people that if she was threatened with her life and the only way she could get out of it would be to tell a lie, she would tell the truth.
Yeah.
She speaks that truth in such a way that there is no other option. And I think Baldwin's kind of that same kind of fabric is there is no other option except to speak up about these things that matter. And Baldwin would probably have a hell of a lot to say about today's world. God bless it. And you describe Baldwin as this prophet of humanity. You talk about him as someone who is making waves, but doing so strategically, right? Like, I mean, Baldwin was a strategist in some ways, even though he was an artist. He knew how to work the system in such a way that he was able to articulate a vision of a new possibility, not only for the United States, but for the world. I'm curious, as anyone would be curious, who do you see as a prophet following in the footsteps of James Baldwin, as Elijah and Elisha? Who is getting the mantle? Is that possible for someone to hold the mantle of James Baldwin as the prophet of the modern era? And who might that be?
Oh, Rob, that's such a good question, because, like, what we're asking is where's our continuity? Who is speaking the truth to the society right now? And I have two thoughts, and they are linked because they were both students of James Cone. I think Senator Warnock would be one of those people, not just in his aspect as a senator of the United States, as a politician, but I mean, honestly, in his role as pastor to the church that Martin Luther King pastored, that sense of continuity, and Baldwin's complicated love for Martin Luther King is represented over and over again in his work. And I think also Kelly Brown Douglas, the great African American theologian, is maybe the most important voice speaking truth into our culture right now. Last year, her most recent book won what I like to think of as the Nobel Prize for Religious Studies. And the sort of recognition that she received because of that is only this well-deserved recognition of the kind of prophetic voice that she has had for years and years. And I say this, I don't know Senator Warnock, although I would love to. I would love to sit at his feet. But Kelly and I are friends, and we have done a number of public programs together over the years. And she has been one of the most transformational figures in my life in this work that I do now on racial reconciliation and white supremacy. And what I love about her most is also what I find most terrifying about her. She tells me the truth. And, it's essential, not just in personal relationships, but, in the larger discourse. And I think that that's what Baldwin does. And he tells the truth in love. And I believe that Kelly tells me the truth in love. when we're on stage together and I say something and she says, Greg, that's fine as far as it goes, but there's more. And I'm like, all right, teach me.
She's one of those ones
so
that you just got to listen to. And I feel like there with Kelly Brown Douglas and with Raphael Warnock, there are people that you're transfixed, not just because of what they're saying, but because they have lived it in some ways. And they've lived the Baldwinian kind of some of what Baldwin went through in some ways, in some capacities, maybe not to the extent that Baldwin did, but I see the connections there, and that makes a lot of sense. I will say my favorite Raphael Warnock story is that I was invited to preach at Ebenezer Baptist by Dr. Warnock a few years back, and I had not checked my calendar too closely, only to realize that the Sunday was actually my first wedding anniversary. So I was going to be away for my first wedding anniversary, Greg. I called Dr. Warnock and he said, well, that's unacceptable. So he flew down Stephanie too, so that we could have, I mean, in this moment of great upheaval, we had just realized, we were just starting a public theology kind of career for me. And I was still very new at shared calendars and stuff like that. But all that's to say is he was so kind to extend and say, look, we're all in this together and we can work this out. And to him, that was small potatoes, but it was a nice gesture of like saying, hey, I see that you're new at this. Let me help you get along the way too. And so
let's fix this tiny problem.
Let's fix this tiny problem. Yeah. So listen, you years and years and years from now, you reach the new Jerusalem, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
I imagine you will say hello and exchange pleasantries with our Lord, maybe St. Peter or St. Paul. But then you run up to Baldwin.
Augustine.
Okay. Insert name. But the next person you run up to is, of course, James Baldwin, if not before Augustine. You have him sign copies of your book. You sit at the welcome table that he speaks of, and so many before him have spoken of. What might you ask him as you sit on that heavenly Parisian street that you don't have answered now?
Oh, at the Café de Flore or the
Yeah. I mean, you're there. You've got time. You've got eternity. So
what are you
going to ask him?
Well, because it's the New Jerusalem, we are in this space where I don't have to ask about hatred. I don't have to ask about racism. I don't have to ask about bigotry of any kind. I would want to ask him about beauty.
Wow.
Because Baldwin is one of my 3 or 4 favorite writers, like just across the board. I mean, even taking all the race and justice out of it, which is the work that I do right now.
Right.
If there is a class in which Baldwin's work is appropriate, I am teaching him. Sophomores to graduates, whatever that looks like. And I acknowledged him in Bastille Day because his novel Another Country was one of several works that helped me to do my work. And I have absolutely no reservations in saying Baldwin is so much better a writer than I am, even at this stage of my life. And I don't imagine that I'm ever going to reach that spot where he is. I would want to talk about art and beauty. I would want to talk about story. I would want to talk about grace and hope, which are the things that I look for in great stories. And because I know that he was a person who enjoyed a good bottle of brown liquid, that, I would ask him to crack open his favorite, whatever that might be. One of the fun things, Rob, that I found, by the way, in doing archival research at the Ransom Humanities Center here in Austin, was that he had asked his accountants to set up a yearly expense, like a spreadsheet for him. And there was a substantial outlay for spirits, for a creativity and thought. And as somebody who has been known to crack open a bottle of the brown liquid, either at the end of the day or in an afternoon when I'm trying to get something written. I would love to sit with him over a good bottle of whiskey and talk about art and beauty. And, when we reach that place, which is the New Jerusalem, Augustine and some of the other church fathers used to talk about, and Augustine said this explicitly, whatever is true and beautiful is of the Lord. And there we would be in this place of truth and beauty, which Augustine taught about and Baldwin wrote about and tried to show us. And that for me would be the conversation I would want to have.
It sounds like your corner booth in heaven is Augustine, Greg Garrett, and James Baldwin. What a table! Gosh, to sit at that.
It would be the heavenly version of Harry's New York bar.
That's what. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Wow. What a gift that would be, and what a gift that will be. Listen, we give everybody opportunity. Listen, I could talk to you for hours and hours, and we would still have an interesting podcast, I think.
Same.
But we do have to be mindful of the time. On this season of the podcast that I love getting to host and getting to talk to people like you, Greg, I'm curious, is there someone right now that you admire that you'd like to give a shout out to on the podcast?
Oh, there is. There are so many great writers doing important work right now about race, reconciliation, racial repair. Last week, Robert P. Jones launched his most recent book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. It's a brilliant book. And I love Robbie as a human being. I admire him as a scholar and a writer. And we're actually doing some events together where we're talking to each other as writers in public forum. And I would want to commend The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy to people, but all of Robbie's work, White Too Long, The End of White Christian America, and the ongoing work that his organization, PRRI, does in polling, like important polling on race, religion, and politics. As a writer, I use that all the time. And so in my nonfiction work, sort of separate from this James Baldwin book, I'm largely writing about white Christian nationalism, white supremacy, racism in the church. And PRRI is an essential, it's an essential resource for me and for anybody who cares about race, religion, and politics in America.
Well, Greg, I want to say this for the record. I'm continually amazed at the people that not only come on this podcast, but show up in my life beyond this podcast. You're one of those people who some people come on and I talk to them and, we go our ways and they come, podcast airs, people enjoy it or not, or whatever. You're one of those people that I have found to be both compelling, intriguing, and kind. You have shown me the heart of God. You have continually been generous in your time and willingness to share your talents with me and with the world. We're so grateful that you've written so much, and we know that there is so much more to look forward to. The book is The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. It's out with Orbis Books. You can find it there at the Orbis Books website. We'll link it on our show notes. You can find it elsewhere where you buy your books. Be sure to get Greg's newest book, along with other books like his fabulous novel, Bastille Day, that came out. Was it earlier this year or last year?
Yeah, it was in April of this year.
You just keep writing books, man. Well, we're proud of you. So thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
You're so very welcome, Rob. It's a pleasure.
Beloved Journal is a podcast on a mission. Check out our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast was hosted by the Reverend Rob Lee. Find him on Twitter at RobLee4 or on Instagram at RevRobLee. You can find our social media on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter by searching for Beloved Journal and finding our logo. Beloved Journal's theme music is a cover of the Golden Girls theme song done by Mipso. Seriously, they're the best band in the world. This podcast was the dream of Stephanie Lee and was produced by Maggie the Golden Doodle and Frank the Poodle. Go show the world that it's worth fighting for. And as always, thanks for listening.